Morning on BBC Radio Scotland.
It's 8:05. It's Sunday morning and it's Connie McLaughlin with you. How are you doing? I hope you're well. Lovely to be back with you again. I'm with you as always until 10 o'clock today. Listen, we have got so much to pack in the next 2 hours. Some really interesting, life-affirming discussion because we're going to be talking about life-changing events and exploring how do you find the way forward when something really big has happened in your life. Like I'm talking the really most challenging of times. We're going to be delving into that as well as the fascinating phenomenon of near-death experiences, right? I'm going to be talking about whether the tunnel of light is really a glimpse into the world beyond or whether science can explain exactly what is happening. We're going to be hearing a really interesting story, a really powerful story actually from one of Scotland's most high-profile former footballers about his experiences. Do stick around if you can. It's just after 9 o'clock. It's definitely not to be missed. And in a couple of minutes' time, we're going to be looking at the fear and misinformation sometimes as well that goes around giving birth. Right, our mums to be given enough information, maybe too much information sometimes, and the right guidance. Should they be given more support to help them to give birth? Right, all that coming up before 10 o'clock. But let's start things off. giving birth, but not only giving birth, I guess what happens with the sort of lead up to it and that fear and anxiety, and then also what happens if something goes wrong, which many people call birth trauma. It's a term used to describe the distress experienced by a mum during and after childbirth. It can be physical, it can be emotional, or it can be psychological. It's not just about what happens as well during the actual labour and the birth. It can be about what happens, I guess, before and after it. And for some people, it can cause real long-term problems for obvious reasons. So I guess the question this morning is, why is there still so much shame around giving birth, and what more can be done to help support women in, I guess, what is one of the most vulnerable times of their life? Here to talk to me about this in a little bit more details, Dr. Poonam Krishan, who is a GP and also experienced birth trauma herself. Morning, Poonam.
Good morning, Connie.
Good to speak to you this morning. Also with me is Lisa Crabb, who runs the Birth and Baby Space, an antenatal group based in Glasgow. Morning, Lisa.
Good morning. How are you all doing?
Really good, thanks. I think this is a really important conversation, not just because I'm sitting here as someone who's almost 32 weeks pregnant and thinking about the prospects of all these fun things that I've got to come, but also, Poonam, I think that when you're faced with something as life-altering as I guess what's sort of ahead of me right now, it does get you delving into some things. It does get you looking and seeing how much of an issue this can be for women, the prospect of trauma around birth. And it's something that you've experienced firsthand.
Yeah, it is. And I think for some reason, I think the narrative of kind of giving birth, it's very skewed in that we're only kind of you almost kind of end up in a bit of an echo chamber where you're given, the information about, well, this is what happened. You have these expectations, but you're never really given the potential complications or what if something goes wrong. That kind of preparation and conversation is very much missing, whether it's sort of in the medical realm, whether it's within antenatal classes. It is changing, mind you, but, whether it's within those spheres or whether you're speaking to other people that have had children or have gone through pregnancies, people tend to shy away or just don't speak about it because, well, it's just, I don't know, it's just not the done thing.
I'm having the opposite experience. I feel as if everyone and their granny wants to tell me about their bad experiences. Honestly,
really?
And there's been a lot of preparation, I guess. So I've been going through that whole experience of going to these different classes and all the rest of it. And there is very much, and maybe this is what you're saying about this tide is beginning to turn, but I don't know if it's maybe going too far in the opposite direction because it's all about sort of like what can happen and being aware. And Lisa, that idea of, I guess, preparing, this is the phrase that I hear all the time, preparing for something that you can't really prepare for, be open-minded to the prospect of the fact that a birth plan basically just goes out the window. I think that's just there to try and make you feel better.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. It's so difficult. We, in our antenatal classes, it is really important for people, the pregnant people and their birth partners that I work with, that they have all the information so that they are able to make informed decisions. I definitely think a lot of the issues around giving birth is being unprepared and not realising that you should be getting this information so that you're able to process what is going on, what's happening, what your options are around that, and giving back an element of control so that the decisions can be made together with your healthcare provider and you and your birth partner so that you feel that you're in control of what's happening.
Poonam, for you, do you feel as though, because you had two very different experiences, didn't you? Tell us a little bit about the sort of contrast between both.
So 9 years ago was when my eldest was born, and I'd gone through, a very healthy pregnancy. There was no issues. I'd never even been in hospital for anything prior to that moment. And I guess, you'd think that as a doctor who has kind of done obstetrics and gynecology as part of our training, that I had seen it all. But during my pregnancy, I just don't know. It's one of those things that when you are well through it all, you don't think about things going wrong. You just don't. And you're willing for everything, obviously, to go fine. And I was prepared to have this very kind of, natural birth is what I'm going to say. But, and just total freak incidents where I ended up having a huge loss of volume within seconds after my son was born, and they struggled to contain the bleeding. I ended up, long story short, on a ventilator in intensive care with multi-organ failure, and a very touch and go situation where my husband was told, like, we don't think she's going to make it. And to say that that was traumatic would be, again, just such an understatement, because at that time, the feelings that when I did start to get better, which took something like physically, I think the healing took about a couple of years. But the emotional, and I ended up with severe postnatal depression and just this complete inability to come to terms with why or how or what happened to me, this sense of complete failureism. I'd go to postnatal classes, other mums, and everyone had like such lovely experiences compared to me. So I felt very isolated, and I just really struggled to process that, and got help and support for the postnatal depression, and kind of moved on, and was, we didn't think we'd ever have any other kids again, and 7 years later, in the thick of the pandemic, I don't seem to do birth very well. I had my daughter. And that's when I was diagnosed at my very first appointment with PTSD secondary to birth trauma. Now, the conversation around birth trauma is one that's not had very often. And it is something I'm very passionate about, because the conversation within the NHS is lacking, particularly sort of in the kind of the immediate aftermath of a birth. But I was referred in the NHS to a birth trauma psychologist, who was the beginning of the change of everything, because she helped me kind of prepare for this second birth. And because it was high risk, it was a C-section this time. And again, the narrative around, surgical births is quite negative sometimes. People have their opinions. People have opinions for whatever you do when it comes to birthing. But I went on to have the most magical, mystical, stunning birth, albeit, it was in lockdown and all the rest of it. And you thought that would have been actually very traumatic, but actually there was so much healing that came from that, from my first experience, just because I was so supported on this occasion.
I remember speaking to you not long after you'd found out that you were pregnant with your wee girl, your second child, and remember thinking about just how fearful you were.
Terrified.
But how quickly you turned that around. Honestly, it makes me, and I know this is such a cliche, Lisa, you must see this all the time with the women that you work with, but just how amazingly strong women can be in this situation. But I think there's almost like an expectation that we should be okay with this. I think that's something that I'm that I'm hearing quite a lot as well. Poonam was talking there about this idea of a lot of judgment attached to lots of different things. I think my experience has been there's been a lot of judgment about feeling a bit fearful about it and not really wanting to say, I'm quite scared about what might happen here, and not really wanting to sort of verbalise that. Is that, do you hear that a lot from the women that you work with?
Oh, certainly. I think that, it is this daunting, anxious, new phase of your life. This, for majority of people that I'm working with, it's their first baby. They don't know what to expect. As Dr. Christian said, like, a lot of people haven't potentially been in a hospital environment before, so it's also those expectations and how they deal with that. So yes, there's absolutely that, but as you say, I hope the tides are changing, because certainly within our classes, it is very much air how you feel, talk about how we can empower you, talk about how we can achieve a positive birth experience, and that the mode of delivery, how you bring your babies into the world, it doesn't, not that it doesn't matter, but what matters is that you have a lovely experience, the day that you meet this lovely, amazing new person, that you have a wonderful time, however that goes down.
How do you do that effectively, Lisa, whenever the reality of it is you're not really sure how it's going to go? Because the two different experiences that Poonam's just explained to us can happen to anyone at any point. So how do you talk someone down whenever the reality is they could potentially be facing something that is, life-threatening, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, I suppose, again, as Dr. Christian said, like the second time round, she felt more supported. She was listened to. She was, things were talked through and discussed. So I think having the information is important. I think having accurate information that is useful to you and that you would know, I suppose a lot of it is almost navigating the maternity system as well, and giving people realistic expectations of what their care might look like and what to do to optimize a positive experience. A lot of our classes are very much geared towards birth partners being advocates for the pregnant people, because as you mentioned earlier on, it is a very vulnerable time for people who are having babies, and they, and with the strongest will in the world, very often even very confident, powerful women in these situations can lose their power. So a lot of it is trying to focus on birth partners and what they can do to help support, so that you do have that continuous support all the way through that birth experience, and it is a more positive experience.
Given everything that you've been through, Poonam, what, if any way, or how in any way has your advice changed to your patients, particularly women who are pregnant? What has your sort of approach to that changed in any way?
Absolutely, completely changed. And I think what's important, I agree with everything that Lisa said there. We've got to approach every mum with, it's got to be an individualised care plan. And I think that conversation and that mechanism of support is very much missing within the NHS at the moment. Yeah. I certainly, the first time around, 6 weeks later, went for my baby check, which is still done. The thing is, it's very different across the country and across different GP practices. Yeah. But babies get that 6-week postnatal check. Mums sometimes get it depending on the practice, and they'll probably get it with the nurse. But what's changed for me is that mum has become very much a primary focus, because what I've learned through my own experience and time again, when mum is well, mentally, physically and emotionally, everything else just works in that system for her. But when the focus is very much on baby, which it always is, and of course you understand to a degree, but mum gets forgotten. So I, now every 6-week check, and I do them for the babies in my practice, mum is booked in with me, and the first thing I always ask is, how was the birth? Because not everyone has that positive birth experience, and sometimes all you want is actually space to speak about it. Yeah. and validate that what happened to you, it's real, you're not broken. What can we do to now help and support you? And if that means bringing them back for conversations, referring them for, psychology early, that early intervention is everything. That's the beginning of the healing for mum. It's not just, how's the wound? Okay, everything all right? Right. Baby's gaining weight. Brilliant. Off you go. That is just how to feel a mum right there who's been through a traumatic episode.
And that is, I guess, what we're trying to move closer to is that idea of the more holistic approach to the mum and baby. Listen, we're out of time. I could talk to you both about this all morning. But great to have you on. Thanks very much, Dr. Poonam Krishan and Lisa Crabb. Thanks very much for your time. If there's anything that maybe you're thinking, I'd like some more information on this, or maybe something that you've been affected by the issues we've been talking about, you can go onto the BBC Action Line. You can visit bbc.co.uk/Action Line. Now, it's 8:23, right? And after 10 o'clock this morning, it is the Sunday show. This morning, they're chatting about what's happening with the SNP, especially in Westminster, where after Ian Blackford said he's stepping down, they're going to be speaking to the party's president, Mike Russell, just after 11 o'clock. And also, they'll be talking more about the number of Strep A cases in Scotland that has been rising across the UK, certainly. But how is it looking in Scotland? They're going to be speaking to a consultant paediatrician about that. And also having a wee discussion about the fact that it's England-Senegal in the World Cup in Qatar a little bit later. We're going to be talking, or they're going to be talking to a Scottish Senegalese super fan a little bit later. So that's going to be between 10 and 12 today. So lots more to come. We're going to get a little bit more music for you now.
trying to kill me. That's why I stay faded in stone. Cause when I leave the house, I never know if I'm coming home. Bullets got no name, it's a dirty game. Wanna be thugs, drive by for some ghetto fame. The homie got popped 6 times, need surgery. Hit my cigar, holding tears cause it's hurting me. I write my cousin in the pen to see if he okay. He's locked up on his little girl's first birthday. To this day, love my homies dearly. Down to die with them. I ball, then they ball. You hear me, I'ma ride with them. You fall, then we fall. I'll be there when you need me. It's easy, all you gotta do is beat me.
If you're lost, you can look and you will find me. Time after time.
Only time will
Before
tell.
I will catch you, I'll be waiting. Time after time.
Only time
If
will
you're
tell.
lost, you can look and you will find me. Time after time.
Only time will
Before
tell.
I will catch you, I will be waiting. Time after time.
Still got me trapped. And homies, I feel your pain. See, these streets is like a living hell. And the devil will be the dope man. And everybody wanna fix. From heroin to even powder. My little nephew was a crack baby. When he hollered, mom put in his baby bottle in these streets. Got me doing shit that I really don't want to. But niggas gotta be strapped with bulletproof rest. The homies will ride you and just blast on you. In the game, got me tripping. But you know I'm never slipping. And every bitch with a pretty face and a big butt. You can't just jump in the pool skinny dipping. Cause you know what? Life ain't the same, nigga. I mean, times done change. Keep your eyes on your enemy. And if you're a hustler, get what you get and get out, man. Cause see, these streets, they don't pay to be dumb. And real homies stick together like Candy and Pete. And down a ride when the time comes.
If you're lost, you can look and you will find me. Time after time.
Only time
If you
will
fall, I
tell.
will catch you, I'll be waiting. Time after time.
Only time
If
will
you're lost, you
tell.
can look and you will find me. Time after time.
Only time will tell.
I will catch you, I will be waiting. Time after time.
I watch my nieces and nephews grow before my very eyes. I pray that they could make something out their lives. You could lose your breath at the speed of light. Running from death, chasing dreams in the heat of the night. You might could lose your sight. In these streets, ain't no peace. With your eyes, see the last man standing off his feet. But times has changed, never love material things. If I could promise anything, you gon' leave the way you came. Check my homie Sean Diggs, doing life plus one. When he called me collect to accept, I press 1. My Benz is your Benz, my house is your home. If you ever need a friend, call Abel on the phone.
If you're lost, you can look and you will find me.
All the real ballers and players out there.
Time
If you
will
fall,
tell.
I will
ball
catch
till
you,
we
I'll
fall,
be
though.
waiting.
But we gotta be there when the homies call.
Only
Ride,
time will
ride.
tell.
Real. Send a few dollars to your boy in the penitentiary. Keep your boy on the street. You know what? Real homies stick together. They don't turn on each other. Remember that. No Limit family, baby. Master P, Kane and Abel.
If you fall, I will
word.
catch you. I will be waiting.
We here when our homies need us, though, you heard? Ain't nothing changed. Just got a little change, though. But it's still the same, though. It's still the same. I'm rough. Down for whatever. No limit for life, baby.
And time after time, it's 28 minutes after 8. That was a really insightful conversation, wasn't it, with Lisa and Poonam? Just that idea of, I guess, the expectations surrounding such a huge moment in, I was going to say a woman's life, but actually in a family's life, and just how that changes things, especially if it doesn't necessarily go to plan. We're going to be chatting about life-altering events a little bit later in the programme, those moments that could be like a wake-up call to you, something really dramatic that happens. And I guess for you, what happens next? How do you sort of navigate your way through that? We're going to be hearing two people's very, very personal stories about what happened to them and how they managed to get through it. We're also going to be talking about the changes to Scottish museums in just a second as well, given all the furore that's been happening in the royal household. I feel like we say that quite a lot over the last week or so surrounding Prince William and Kay and his godmother and all the rest of the stuff that goes along with that. We're going to be speaking about that in just a second, but it is time now to delve into our 100 Years of Scottish Stories collection. Today's story comes from Alex Dixon, who tells us the tale of his late mother-in-law, who was born in a village just outside Halifax in England, and she completed her training right as a district nurse in Edinburgh. Her first placement was in the fishing village of Lochinver, but she was so homesick back in 1944 that, get this, she decided to cycle all the way back to Halifax.
100 years of Scottish stories across 2022 on BBC Radio Scotland.
Setting off early from Lochinver, her route took her down the Ackletaboo Road, which in these days was just a rough track.